Okay, so here we are going to be starting lesson 1.0, which is actually going to be the actual rig. And we're starting with the legs because the legs sort of have the least number of new tools that you need to use. So we're just going to be using IKs, groups, constraints. They get put together in a little bit of a complicated fashion, but overall there's the least number of new things to learn with the legs. You don't necessarily have to start with them on a given rig. But to get started, my model, I've turned on the X-ray right here for the model so that I can see through it to see any joints that I might put in. I've also got all of my layers that have geometry on them referenced so that I can't, I don't want to be able to touch that. I just want to be able to easily work with the joints. The other way you can do that is this button right here. This will turn off selection for any surface objects. So that way you can't touch the geometry. It just makes life easier since the joints do have to be overlapping. Alright, but this is where we're going to put the leg eventually. I'm actually going to get rid of this one. Just wanted you to see what it looks like, so I'm going to hit delete. Okay, so how to begin? Well, we begin by going to the side view. Alright, to the side of your model, whatever camera that happens to be. And we're going to use our joint tool. But there's going to be 5 joints that we lay down at first, right? So there's going to be a hip, a knee. Let me zoom in here for a second. An ankle. And then there's going to be a joint right at the ball of the foot. And then the toe of the foot. And don't worry if you didn't get them in the exact right place. We're going to be able to fix that after I put them down. You'll note that there's no joint actually at where the heel is. That's a common misconception. We want the joints to be where things deform, right? They bend at the knee, they bend at the ankle, they bend in the middle of the foot, and then the last joint to sort of end this joint chain. Okay, so how do we fix where these joints are? Because sometimes we don't necessarily put them exactly where we wanted to the first time around. So the first thing I'm going to do is when I click on a joint, what you don't want to do is move it like this. It's sort of bad form, changes the numbers up here, and it changes how things are oriented. Instead, what we want to do is you can go into insert mode. We've seen this before. And where normally you would change the pivot point of something, when it comes to joints, using insert mode lets you move the joint independently, right? It wasn't moving a toe. I can move the toe independently. So I can change where these joints are without worrying about how the other ones follow. I can change where this ankle is and not worry that the rest of the foot's going to follow. Alright, so, and then I could hit insert again and I would get out of that. The other way you can do that if you just want to sort of toggle the insert mode is you can hold down D on the keyboard and that will turn that on briefly and you can move the joint. And then I let go and it will turn it off. What you do not want to do not want to do, is rotate joints before you started doing anything. We want all our joints to read 0 on the rotations. So you definitely don't want to be rotating anything to move it into place, but you want to use the move tool specifically in insert mode. So I've got my joints where I want them in the side view. And remember, we always draw joints in an orthographic view because otherwise they go crazy. So now, of course, I need to go into my front view and move this to the center of the leg rather than going up and down the middle of the person's body. Okay, so next step, naming everything. And you want to tag this with either an L or a left underscore, or just I do the word left and then a capital letter for the next word, left hip. But you want to put left on the front of all these because you can't have more than one joint with the same exact name. So I can't have 2 things named knee. And also, if you do this now, getting the joints for the right leg will be much easier. Much faster. Left foot. And of course, left toe. And also keep in mind, since these things are, if we look in our hypergraph, one joint is parented underneath the next, you'll remember from parenting that if you go up and down on your keyboard, so these are the up and down arrows, you can look at the hypergraph and pick walking. This is what this is called, so I can sort of key my way through these joints, making it a little bit easier to work with. Alright, so halfway there to getting these joints done. Next step. When you get to more complicated things and when you're working faster, you're laying down the whole skeleton first rather than just the legs. You may think to you may rotate something, or in just testing out where things are, you may not zero everything out. So one thing you want to do always is modify freeze transformations. Now for joints, that will not affect the translates because those really don't have anything to do with what we're doing, but it will affect the rotates. For example, if I was to move this for whatever reason and had a rotation on it, that would be very bad. But I could say modify freeze transformation and it would freeze all transforms for me. Obviously I don't want that. Alright, so hopefully I zeroed everything out. Freeze transform. There we go. The other thing we have to be concerned with is something called joint orientation. And I want you to take a really close look. I'm going to hit Q so we can see this. You can barely see a blue line and a red line, and if I turn around this way you can see a little green line. You can see that in all of the joints. What this is the direction that the joint is oriented to, and you can see the red lines are always pointing down. Down, down, down. It's pointing down the joint chain. That means the X direction is pointing down the joint chain. That's good. You can see that the blue lines are all pointing to the side, which is good, except they're not all pointing to the same side. Most of them are going to the left, and then this one is going to the right, our right. And then, of course, depending on which direction the blue line is going, the yellow line might be pointing to the front or the back. There's several reasons to make sure these are going in the same direction. One of them being, if I click on this knee joint and I spin it this way, it goes in positive numbers. But if I spin the hip in the same direction, I've got negative numbers. Now that's confusing for a lot of reasons. We want positive numbers all going one way, negative numbers all going one way. Let's see, so we've got X's mostly pointing down the joint chain, but the Z-axis, you can see actually that the one for the knee is pointing in a different direction than the others, right? So there's a couple things we can do to fix this. One is to use, under here, the Orient Joint tool. Go to that, go to Reset Settings, make sure they're all proper. And I hit Orient. And what this will mostly fix is if this X wasn't pointing quite down the right way. If you do anything like moving them joints, they might no longer point in the right direction. So this will at least orient the joint, make sure all of the X directions are pointing the right way. But it still doesn't solve this problem. Maya, for whatever reason, seems to think that's the right direction for that to point in. So we need to tell Maya otherwise. Okay, so to solve this second problem, we're going to need to get into a little bit of something called MELScript. Very simple process. It uses this bar right down here that you don't even normally see during my tutorials. And we also have to go into, instead of being in object mode like we are now, we actually need to go into this component mode, or select by component type. So I'm going to click on that. And you can see this turns this weird color blue, but I also need to click on this little question mark. And when I do that, now I can see the joint orients. I can, see these. And you can manually change these here using, this, but I dislike that because it's extremely inaccurate. There are occasions where that will come in handy when we do the hand joints. But for right now, we want to be able to just rotate this 180 degrees, whoop, that way. So we're going to use a bit of MELScript. It's very easy. It's simply the word rotate, space -R, space -OS, space number, space number, space number, and then a semicolon. Alright, and when I say number, I mean we're actually going to type in a certain number of degrees. Alright, so with this selected, I'm going to type in rotate, space -R, space -OS, and then those three numbers I mentioned, they're actually in the order of X, Y, and Z, as is pretty much anything with three different variables in Maya, and they're always in that order. And actually, in this case, I believe we need to rotate it along the X-axis, right? So the X number, the first number, is where we'd put a number, so we'd type in 180. And And because Maya's smart-ish, if we don't type in the next two numbers, it just doesn't do anything for them, right? So I hit rotate -R-OS space 180, and I hit enter, ta-da, and it flips it around, right? Now, if you were happening to do this, if you had to do this to multiple joints, you could hit up on the keyboard when you were in this panel, and you would be able to get back your code that you just wrote. Or you can click on this button right here, and you should be able to see, there we go, rotate, etc., etc. And actually, you can see it's written just like everything else. This is the Mel write-up of everything we've been doing so far. So I highlight this, and I move this, and I clear this, and I undo this, etc., etc. I rotated right here 0 degrees, and then I rotated it blah 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 on the Y, and then I didn't rotate it on the Z, and then I undid that. So that's all we're doing. We're just telling Maya in very direct terms what to do with everything. So, but now I've got all my axes pointing in the right direction, so I go back to selecting things in object mode. And as long as it's highlighted, you can see, yep, red and green and yellow are all going in the correct direction. And I know this seems like a lot of work, but keep in mind, we don't have to do any of that for the next, for the other leg, right? Because there's something called the mirror joint tool. This is an awesome tool because all that work of freezing transformations and orienting joints and all these things, placing it exactly where we need it, it's going to do that, but opposite for the other leg. And so let me explain this here. Let me reset this. Okay. So this is what your stuff should look like. And right now, there's a couple things we need to check. First of all, what axis to work on? Well, with my particular model, we turn it to the side, and we see it's X and then Y. That's what's kind of splitting it across this way and splitting it up this way. So that's what I use here. You may be on, if your model is facing 90 degrees to mine, then yours would be on ZY right here. But mine's on XY, so I select that. I'm going to select mirror function behavior. I will show you why in a minute. And I'm going to say search for left, replace with right. Yes, folks, we don't have to rename anything, which is awesome. So I hit mirror, and you can see in my hypergraph, ta-da, it made an all-new joint chain, named everything for me, and if I go back down here, I can see it's placed it exactly where the other one was. And the reason for the mirroring behavior is what I want. If we click both of these, and I rotate them along the z-axis in a certain direction, right? They both move forwards and backwards. But if I rotate them along the y-axis, I get this. Now see, when we're rigging, we want to make sure that positive numbers don't necessarily mean left or right, they mean out and in, right? So, out, in, whoa, like that. Or, same for this direction. Turning the feet out, turning the feet pigeon-toed. Okay, so very important. If we didn't do that, if I delete that. Alright, so if we go back to the mirror joint options and we select orientation instead of behavior, and I hit mirror, and I select both, and I use this, what we're going to get is this. I do know some people, maybe that might work like this, but honestly for me, it's, and you know, for as an animator, it's more intuitive when it means the same thing practically for each leg, not technically screen direction. So I prefer that positive numbers mean, you know, turning both feet out, not turning both feet to the left. Although your mileage may vary depending on who you're working for. Okay, one last step with the joints before we go on to bigger and better things. I'm going to go into the front view here. And we want to actually, before we start putting on IKs and other things, I actually want to use my joint tool and create a joint between these two. If I hold down X, it'll go right to the center, which is where I want it, and I hit enter. And this is going to be the root joint for the whole rig. This is going to be the root for the spine that the spine goes to. Both the legs are going to connect to it. And as a matter of practicality, it's just easier to, before I put anything else on, shift select these two, and then that one random joint, I hit P on the keyboard. And you can see here on my rig, I got my root joint. Let me select that and rename it. Root. And my two legs directly underneath it. Okay, so easier to do this now than later when you've already got stuff on it, and then it can maybe mess with your IK. Ooh, we certainly don't want it that far forward though. Huh. There we go. Alright, so that's it here. The next lesson will be placing IKs and controls on the leg joints.